this computer. All right. Hey, everyone. So we are here. We are recording. If you pop in and you don't want your name or image on the recording, please go ahead and change that in the settings. Wanted to let you know. You are in the HyperRubric workshop / webinar. And I am Malia Hoffman, and this is
Christian Science.
Yeah, so we're talking today about a tool that leads progression through or leads students through progression. And so if you want access to these slides or Google Slides, that is the tiny URL. It is case sensitive. So go ahead and type that into your browser and you should be able to have access to it. You can choose to edit to your drive, or you can make a copy. If you make a copy, if we change it, you won't get any of those changes, but you might want to make a copy and change it for yourself anyway. So that's fine. So here are some QR codes to access everything as well. So you can click that QR code. You'll get the slides to the presentation as well if you missed the tiny URL. That other QR code is to all the Google Drive with the folder and the docs and some templates that we will use as part of our workshop, part of the webinar today. And then we just ask that you do a Google survey, whether you're watching this video or you're here live. We ask that you do the exit survey, and it's not actually a Google form anymore. It's a Qualtrics. So I just want to make you aware that that was changed just before this presentation. And so as mentioned, this is your team. I'm an assistant professor at Cal State Fullerton. I teach in the College of Education in the elementary and bilingual ed department.
And I'm a 6th grade teacher in the Savannah School District at Holder Elementary School.
And so today we're going to talk about what is the background of HyperRubrics. We're going to do a small group assessment, large group discussion. We're going to create, we'll break if we need to, and then we'll present the work that you create together, and then we'll give you some individual time to work on things and then wrap it all up.
So basically HyperRubric might be new to some of you. So we want to know, what do you wonder about this topic? Like, what comes to mind when you think, okay, HyperRubric? I know that for me, it was completely foreign when I decided to dive into it and continue to learn about it. So what do you wonder about today's topic?
Yeah, and so now is a good time to pause the video and just jot down some notes about your thoughts, your wonders, just so that way you can actively participate in this when you're asynchronously participating. And if you want to do some like word association, you could consider what is a HyperRubric if you know what HyperDocs are. So that's a good way to connect that.
So have you used traditional rubrics before? This is an area where we want you to think about just your traditional rubric, which is there's a scale, a number scale, and then it goes from there. You could put a thumbs up.
Yep.
Or a thumbs down.
Yep. So just think about, like how much you use them, maybe when you use them, what types of assignments you use them for.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Maybe you could reflect on the time that it takes to create them and how you might go and reflect and change them over time.
And then, do you like traditional rubrics? Are you a fan of them? Do you like how long it takes to make them? Do the students like them? All of that can be answered here. So how do you feel about them? Do you like them? And do they work for you? I guess too.
And so then our next thought is, our next question is, think about, do the students actually like them? Because, and then also, how much time does it take you to assess something using a rubric?
Yeah. And do they understand the rubric or what they're learning from the traditional rubric?
And so we would ask participants, if you were all in the room, what do traditional rubrics tell you? And what are some answers that we typically get from this question?
Whether or not they're getting like right or wrong, pretty much like yes or no.
Yep.
Did they do how
many points did they get?
How many points did they
get?
So
if it's a 10-point scale, what their score is, right? It's a little bit more deficit based.
Yeah, I was going to say it's very like black and white as well. I
did this, check the box,
checking
right?
your boxes.
Okay. Go ahead.
So traditional rubrics versus HyperRubrics. So let's go with traditional rubric first, because that's what I think most of us are familiar with. Traditional rubrics, it discourages future growth. There is finality. So like we said, it's checking those boxes and you get a hard, point system, 5 points, 4 points. And it doesn't really tell them how they can grow from that. It's just many words were misspelled. Okay, how do I fix that? It doesn't give them the growth there. It can be negative. I know that I've made negative ones in the past because that's, they didn't do this. They've missed 3 points. So there's limitations on it. It's very limited as to the content that could be put in it. Students don't know what to do next to progress. So like we said, it's, the finality of it. It's here's how you get a 5. And then you got that 5 and you're done. Congratulations. It only assesses the final product. So they hand in their project or their paper or whatever they're working on, and you take your rubric and you grade it to that paper, and then they're done. So that's when we use the traditional rubrics usually. It checks the boxes, like we said, they're vague, and only grades that final draft. HyperRubrics. So for a HyperRubric, it's very progressive. It's ever changing. Every time a student self-assesses to it, or the teacher assesses the student to it, it then can change. So as they move up within it, it'll change, and we'll explain all of that later. It's used throughout the entire learning process, not just a final product or final result. There's feedback within it. They can reflect. So there's lots of reflection in a HyperRubric. There's self-assessment and evaluation. I've also used some that kind of like the peers will assess them. So students assess themselves, they self-assess, and then they give it to a peer, and then they can also assess them on the HyperRubric. It transfers pretty easily. There's no grade or scaled score, so there's no hard score for it. And it takes time though. So when it's a process to learn, it takes a lot of time for that. So here are your examples. Up top is a traditional rubric. Like we said, it's, your number scale 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which most people are familiar with. If you look at the 5, it says I can clearly explain how a character develops, connects to a theme, and I do so in a way that adds new insight to the story. That's how they get a 5. But if you look at the 1, it says I struggle to explain how a chapter develops. So going back to the negative process, I struggle to explain. We're telling the student that they don't know how to explain something, instead of trying to give them a more positive feedback role there. It also doesn't tell them how to learn how to explain it. It's just very final there. In the HyperRubric, there's same skills. As you can see, it says the skill, character development, and writing. That's what we're working with here. HyperRubric, if we look at the final one, which would be in that 5 area, which is extending, I can identify how a character develops a theme, including analyzing how they interact with other characters and symbols to develop a complex message. And then if you look at beginning, it says, I can define protagonist, antagonist, conflict, and plot structure. So it's positive, telling them what they can do. If you see those blue underlined words, those are actually hyperlinks. So the best part about this is if they look at it and they say, but I don't know how to do that, we give them the resources. They click on the link, and then they can get taken to a website, a YouTube video, something to show them how to get there. So I tell them, put on your headphones and watch the video, and then they can learn how to add that in or how to move up to the next level. This is a HyperRubric, one of mine that I've created in my classroom. And once again, some of these you'll see are the very beginning, because like we have stated, it's a process. So my very first HyperRubrics were, I would say, not as developed, or I say as good as they are now, because I've learned over time how to make them better. But for mine extending, I can use evidence from the text to support my opinion. I can use the evidence to wrap write a detailed paragraph with transitions and a strong opening and closing sentence. I focus on one thing or two things within the Common Core State Standard that I'm focusing on, and that's what I write the rubrics to. So once again, we're focusing on the cans. I can do these things. And then each one is developing something different every time. So if you look at beginning, it's literally this: I can find and list text evidence. Awesome. If they can get there and they can do that, then let's move them on to the next one. And I would probably say, go to developing. Why don't you watch the videos on punctuation and capitalization? And let's see if we can add that in to finding our text evidence and write some sentences. So every single one changes and adapts to the next category. And our goal is to move them up through each one. So sometimes you'll have some that aren't at beginning. They start right at approaching, and then they'll go to applying, and then they'll get to extending. And once they get to extending and they're there, sometimes my students groan at this part. I'm like, awesome. I love that. And they come in the next day and they have a whole new HyperRubric and it's the same paper or the same, whatever we're working on. And they're like, are you serious? Like, yeah, but now they're beginning.
Yeah. So you might create 2 or 3 HyperRubrics for the same exact assignment. And then you might provide them to different groups of students where they're at in that lesson.
Yeah. They stop groaning eventually once they learn how it all works together.
Yep. So, okay. So on this slide, you can see that the prompt is at the top. So it's writing to explain why. And then the prompt for this writing piece is, what adjective do you think best describes Wesley? Brave or caring? To be sure to use text evidence to support your answer. And so this is the HyperRubric attached to that writing prompt.
Here's another one. That one was writing to explain why. So these are all the different types of, these were 4th grade, I believe, but now I'm 6th grade, so they're a little bit more in detail. And this is an opinion piece. And these are examples of my students writing, actually. So based on what you read, how do you feel about plastic? Is it good, bad? Do we need it? Use evidence from the text to support your answer. Before we move on, I want to make it clear that before I give them a HyperRubric, the students have already written what they or worked on whatever project they're doing. So I don't give them a HyperRubric and then say, write your paper. I have them write their first draft, hand it in, and then I will write the HyperRubrics to their drafts because I have to see where they're at. And that way they can see how they change. I have done it. I've played with it where I've given the HyperRubric first and then had them write to that, but they didn't get the change that I needed to see throughout it. So it's best to let them do their rough draft, do their first draft of whatever they're doing, then give them the HyperRubric and have them assess to it.
How much time would you say goes into this process? From when you create, you have them write their first draft, you create a HyperRubric, and then you have them work on getting that feedback.
It does depend on the grade and how much they're writing. Right now in my 6th grade, honestly, it can take like 2+ weeks sometimes if it's writing, because their papers are also about 2 pages, 2.5 pages, even if it's just a response, because we're expecting an opening paragraph, and then they have to support it and they have to have a closing. So I would say about 2 weeks sometimes.
So let's talk a little bit about that process. So
Okay.
you have them write a first draft, you give them this prompt, this opinion prompt here.
Okay.
And then you would go and create that HyperRubric.
Yes.
And so then you pass that out to them. And then what happens next? So are they assessed with that HyperRubric after you create it right away, or do you ask them to self-reflect?
They self-reflect.
Okay.
So they go back, and I do everything digitally. So they go into Google Classroom, because if I do it digitally, they can click those hyperlinks. So they have their paper, they print them out or do whatever they need to do with it. Some of them don't print it. And then I have them go back to, I'll put the HyperRubric sometimes up on the board if they're all kind of similar. But my last one, I had to have 2 or 3 different HyperRubrics because my students were at that many different writing levels. And so I told them, just open up Google Classroom, go to your ELA tab, click the HyperRubric for Cassie and Mafatu, and then self-assess. And they know what all those words mean because I use them every day in my class. And then you see all of them just put on their headphones, and then they look at it, they read it. And sometimes I'll make them right where they think they are, or they have to raise their hand and tell me. Sometimes I put a check mark on the Google slide and they have to move the check mark to whatever box they think they're in. But they know their next step is to, if they think that they're in approaching, their next step, click that link and watch how to move on. Because they know it's okay to be at the other ones, but the goal is to be at applying. And so and some of them are happy with that. Some of them are happy in approaching.
How often do you have them self-reflect on this?
So I'll have them do it, and then they have to kind of go through and try to change it. And that'll take a day or two because it depends on how much time for writing we have. And then they'll have to do it again. But like I said, sometimes instead of doing it again right away, that's when they do the peer, kind of like peer assessment. So I would think I'm at approaching, and I would print it, write it out, I'm at approaching. And then I would make some changes, and then I would give it to you. And I'd be like, okay, Malia, will you please look at mine, read it? Then you can go on the HyperRubric and at the bottom, tell me where I am. And so we'll see, do they compare to the same one or have I moved up? And then they bring it to me. And then I will assess them as well. So there's probably about 3 to 4 different assessments within just that one rubric without it changing even.
Okay, good.
It's a process.
Yeah. So on the slide, we have 3 different student samples of writing to this prompt. And so if we were in a workshop with several participants, we would discuss these pieces of writing, give you some time to think about that. And then we'll show you the rubric on the next slide, and you would place these student samples 1, 2, and 3 on that HyperRubric where you think that they fall and land. So let's talk about how to create this, right?
Yes. So as you can see, that's the state standard up top. It's this one is for 2nd grade. Write informative explanatory text in which they introduce a topic, use facts and definitions to develop points, and provide a concluding statement or section. Within that Common Core state standard, I wouldn't do the whole standard in one HyperRubric because you have to break it apart because there's too many parts to it. They need to introduce a topic, use facts and definitions. So I would probably in this one do introduce a topic and use a concluding statement. And then the facts would come in later, but that could also be extending. So extending is we've already added the facts. So the hard part is like, if we want them to write a good introduction to anything they're reading, it's going to take time. So that's alone going to be a five-step process, because especially in 2nd grade, their beginning might be, I can write words. That's it. Developing, I can write a sentence. But then approaching might be, not only can they write a sentence, they can write a sentence with correct punctuation, capitalization, and they can write a sentence about a topic. So it's slowly developing, and their extending would be, and then maybe even in approaching, it's that they could write a concluding statement as well. And then by the time they're extending, they can introduce the topic. So if they're writing informative explanatory texts, we kind of have to give them that prompt of introducing what it is they're talking about. So these are all the state standards for 4th grade. This must be when we want them to write it and you guys to create a rubric for yourself, a HyperRubric, which are the opinion pieces, write opinion pieces on texts or topics or text supporting a point of view with reasons and information, which can go back to the ones we just showed you with plastic. These are ones that they're going to look at to write that opinion piece. So you can pick which one you want to, based off of what they wrote, those 3 students and their development there. You can find these standards, look at them and decide which one do I think we need to hit first, or which one, maybe it's the one that they're really missing the boat on. Which would link opinion and reasons using words and phrases. Okay, maybe it's transitions. You know, so I would go to their work, look at it and say, what are they all missing? Because if they're all doing one part, I want to really hit the part that maybe they're all missing, because that's something that we can tie in there. So more standards to pick from.
So let's practice writing it together here.
Okay.
So show us how you do this.
Oh, geez. How do I do this? Okay, so first I always, well, let's pick. First, we have to pick which one we want to do. So are we going to do it for the plastic?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to the plastic. So I'm going to read, based on what you read, how do you feel about plastic? Is it good, bad? This is their opinion. So first I'm going to go to this third person, because it's the smallest, most likely it has the least amount of information. So they just said, we need plastic and not. We need plastic because we need binders, pens, sharpeners, highlighters, pencil boxes, water bottles, and more. Plastic is bad for parks, oceans, lakes, rivers, ponds. So they're just listing things. They're not even linking sentences together about what they need. So right then and there, I'm like, okay, we need to teach them how to transition between sentences. 2 as a good start. 2, the second person is probably, by the looks of it, because they started it with, in my opinion, going to be my strongest one. So in my opinion, I think plastic is bad, but we need it. First, they have a first, they have a second, they have a third. So they can already transition and state that they have an opinion. That one with 3, 2, they're going to need different rubrics probably, but we'll still be able to do this. And then the first one, yes, we need plastic. If we don't, so they didn't state their opinion. Well, they said, yes, we need plastic, but all of us know, right? All of us know that in an opinion piece, it's, and give them those sentence starters. In my opinion, I believe, those are all your opinion sentence starters. So, but at the end they state, my opinion is that it's both good and bad. Awesome. They didn't pick a side. That's great. So I would go back to my state standards and say, okay, link opinion and reason using words and phrases. Yes, but I really would like to provide reasons that are supported with facts and details. I think that's important. You can even do 2, because as you all know, your teachers, this is our standard. And these are just the sub, so we can do more than 1 to try to meet that. And I think that A is pretty strong. Introduce a topic or text clearly, state an opinion, and create organizational structure, because their writing prompt is to a response from a paper. So go back to your paper. So let's start with provide reason that is supported by facts and details. So with beginning, I like to start with beginning sometimes, because I will go to that lowest one and say, what do they need? They can, there's a lot of this back and forth. So this is how you write them, back and forth. They can create sentences. So I would like the first one to actually say, I can state my opinion, because they didn't do that, but we know they can. So they're going to start off right there and they'll be able to change that right away. So, done. And we link it later. And then I usually go to my extending. I always start with my beginning and go to my extending. So it kind of feeds off of the beginning. So we know they can state their opinion. And we decided I can state my opinion and create, let me see, choose a group. Sorry, do you have something to say?
Yeah, you were going to say, provide reasons that are supported by facts and detail.
Thank you.
You were going to add B.
Okay. So I would this is just all right. It changes as I write it. I'll change it 500 times before I put it. So I can state my opinion.
And support it with facts and detail.
Yes.
From the text.
Opinion and that might even move to applying. So I put it there for now. And then later I might be like, oh, let's move it on. So then approaching, if that's my main goal right now, because that is actually my applying, because that means they've met the standard. So see, welcome to a HyperRubric change. So now I know they've met my standard, they can, and they'll probably add a little more after. I can state my opinion and support it with facts and details from the text. Using text evidence, obviously. We can use those words, we can go back to that and change it. Use academic vocabulary wherever we need. But approaching then, where are they almost there? Well, we know they can state their opinion. Sometimes it's redundant, but why can't I spell opinion the first time? I can state my opinion. And I'd probably pick one of those and use details from the text. Because maybe they're not linked. So developing, I might focus on, okay, I know what extending, welcome to my brain. Extending, I would say I can state my opinion and support it with facts and details using transitional words and probably something else, and I'm not there yet. Yeah. And then I'll add to it. You can see the process. You can see how it's happening.
Yeah. And so as she mentioned when she first started writing is that we would go back and we would hyperlink things. That's what makes this a hyper rubric, right? Because now if students need to use their own resources and figuring out what is an opinion, you might hyperlink opinion here. Look for a resource. So it might be a worksheet that you create. It might be a video on YouTube. It might be a blog or a website, something, like that's academic, that is at grade level for them, and link that there. So when this is passed out and they look and they're starting to reflect on their own work, they have the resources to help themselves. So here we'd probably link opinion. We would probably link details from the text for additional information. Here would probably link separately facts, and then again, details from the text. And then here we'd also create or find a resource for the transitional words and hyperlink that.
Yeah. And sometimes like transitional words can be a good one where I will try to, and I will tell them, I'll put it in there twice or something, because I want to link them to a video on how to use those transitional words into a sentence. But then also I give my kids, they have it like paper transitional words, but I will also link it to a PDF because they don't always have their journal with them or something. But also, like Malia said, a lot of times what I do is I just go onto YouTube and I type in how to start an opinion paper for elementary or for second grade. And I make it very specific. Watch it first. Always have to watch it first, or I just put closed captions on and I read it. And then I will link it to that. So, and I've had students, the first time I did that this year, when she was like, oh, this is great. I need this. And was like super excited to get on there, click that link and then learn from it. So yeah. And then they're doing it themselves.
And so that's the kind of the thinking process and the way that you would begin to start to create that hyper rubric for the students. And then
and it does take time. Like I said, it changes all the time.
So we're going to open it up for a discussion now. If there are any questions that you have that you want to ask. But one thing we also want to start with, or just discuss, at least mention, is how you turn these assessments into grades. And so one of the beautiful things about hyper rubrics are that they don't provide a student with a final grade. It's not the end. And then those students have to dig themselves out of that poor grade, because just because they're not at grade level, it shouldn't necessarily reflect their grade. And so like, I know Christiane and I have strong feelings about the way that grades are reflected and the way that students are evaluated, and how that can really just take out their motivation. And so the idea is to grade effort and progress along the way, rather than give them a writing assignment, give them one rubric, and then that's their grade, and then you move on. Because if they're not applying, if they're not meeting that standard, they're not there yet, right? So they still need more the more attention,
Yeah.
more work, more guidance. And that shouldn't necessarily mean that they get a C or a D or an F, right? It just means that they're working, they're progressing.
And I think with HyperRubrics, it does take away a lot, like she was saying, the grades. I have students come up to me, is this an A? Is this a B? It's like, it doesn't matter. Are you meeting the standards? Because at the end of the day, it's their report cards that tell whether or not they're meeting the standard. At my school, we don't do, we're standard based, we're 1, 2, 3, 4. It's very easy to use a HyperRubric and know whether they're 1, 2, 3, or 4. If they're in extending every time, they're getting a 4. If they're, like that's how, if they're beginning, we know they're 1, they're just not at that, they can't meet that standard. They're not even close to that standard. They're probably a grade level behind. And that's okay, because our goal is just to make them better and catch them up if we can. And now they transfer to A, B, C, D is the same thing, right? An A is a 4. And an A is they're meeting that standard. They're ready for the next thing. So it transitions the same. It just doesn't give them 95%. It doesn't give them 100 or 80 points out of 100. So they get to see whether or not they're getting there. And then eventually, as they see the rubric change, like I said, my students grunted the first time they went to a new HyperRubric. Now they see it as if they're going on to a new HyperRubric, it's a good thing, because it's like, oh, I did it. Now what do I get to? Or like, what's next is kind of how you see it. Like, what am I doing? I've passed that. I'm now growing into the next thing.
It really changes the culture of the classroom as growth mindset, and that they are lifelong learners, and that it's not check the box and move on to the next thing. It is that we are constantly working, and everything that we're doing can get better. Even professional writers still work and have editors and work on their writing. So now let me ask you another question.
Yes.
I'm the questioner today.
Please.
Can this be done? Can this be used for math?
Oh, it can be. Now I've used it. I haven't used it for math yet, and I keep saying that. So I need to start using it for math. But yes, I believe it can. It would take time. And I know the hardest thing with math is that we kind of get set on a system of you have to have this lesson or this chapter done by this date, because for most of us who teach 3rd grade and up, we are on a strict schedule for, hey, we have state testing in May, April, whenever you do it. And if we don't have them to those standards by that, we're in trouble. So it's hard to do it with math only because it does take that amount of time. But it could be used for some sort of math project. So if they were doing a math project or a fun, PBL type project, you can incorporate, cross-curricular. Then you are using it for math. You are using it for ELA and all of those things. But that's how you would use it. I've used it for social studies, and I've used it for science.
And this is a lot, right? So we're not by any means expecting or asking any teacher to go and revamp their entire curriculum to use a HyperRubric next week, because that is ridiculous. But what you can do is take the next project, something that you want to revamp and you want to use and think about differently with your students, and create a HyperRubric and start there. And then after you get some practice doing it with that, move on to the next thing. And then eventually you'll have a nice little pile of HyperRubrics that you can use, hopefully from year to year if you're teaching the same grade, and then across levels as well.
And I think the easiest, the start would be to use it for writing. And then it can change and adapt from there. What was I going to say? See my brain. Oh, I was gonna say, I do still use traditional rubrics sometimes. Because sometimes we kind of have to with a project, because we are giving them those points. And they do have some boxes to check, because it is hard on this one. Like, did they color it in? Like you can put that in your HyperRubric, of course, but it is also okay to still use your traditional rubrics. You don't have to redo and change.
I mean, and in some cases, creating a HyperRubric is just going to create more work for you, rather than just working on those things. For the sake of what I do in my students, I had all of them create a HyperRubric, whether they were teaching TK or 5th or 6th grade for a lesson plan. And that was so that they had just the practice to
Yeah.
put that into motion, because they're learning. And so I figured, why not give them exposure to this right away, and hopefully get them thinking about growth mindset in an assessment way instead of in an evaluative finality way. So are there any questions before we move on? All right, so nothing heard, but you can always email us or share your rubrics with us, and we'll be happy to look at them and give you some feedback. But now's a good time to sit and reflect as well as and think about what is one thing that you learned about HyperRubrics today, and maybe think about how you might use it or how you might eventually start with it in your own classroom, if it's something that makes sense to do with any of the items that you do in your class.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I found them very motivational and entertaining way to engage students, because writing is sometimes boring for elementary students, but you made it very effective, and you keep your students on track so they won't be lost.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a great way to apply to classroom.
Yeah, I think you said a really
Yeah.
good thing about keeping them on track and not getting them lost, because students can so often just feel like they're not meeting that standard, and they're so far, like that the class is so far ahead of them, and so why even try? And so you might not even get any work from them, right? But if you're using this, then at least a student feels like, okay, I can start somewhere. There's a place for me here, and I can learn.
Yes,
Mhm.
yes, certainly.
And I think that, like you said, it keeps them on track. They're keeping themselves on track, and it's more independent. And I think they enjoy that part, is they're creating their work and they're able to do it on their own, and we don't have to hold their hand. They don't want us to hold their hand. So it's a fun way for them to kind of, continue with it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Welcome.
So again, here's the slide to the documents that we shared and created for you. You're certainly welcome to have that. I will post the link to the slides in the chat as well. And then this last link here is our contact information. So if you want to share what you're working on, or if you have questions, follow up, this is how we can be reached. And we are certainly happy to engage with you in that. And then we'll also share the link to the evaluation. So I'm just going to stop screen sharing for now and post the feedback link. So the Qualtrics questionnaire on feedback for the presentation. And then I will also post the link to the slides that we just used for the presentation. There you go. And so we'll stick around if you have any questions, and then we will be posting this session for you to view and follow up later on, and then sending out the slides as well. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.